Hello everyone, welcome to this first episode of a new series that I am entitling Get the Facts. My name is Derrick Gillespie. I am a classroom teacher of earth science or geography and the social sciences for over 30 years. I'm also a firm Bible believer, and so I am a Christian apologist, one who defends the Word of God publicly. In this particular presentation, I am focused on dealing with the topic, the moon landings and debunking the conspiracy theories. The moon landing and debunking the conspiracy theories. Now, there are two sets of persons that I would like to be addressing in this particular video. Persons who either believe that the earth is flat. Some of these persons can either be Christians and some are non-Christians. And there are persons who even believe in the fact that the earth is a globe or is a ball-like object. These two sets of persons on both sides of the divide, there are actually persons who believe that the moon landings, and you notice I'm using the word landings, plural, that they were faked. And it's all a conspiracy to fool the public by NASA and all of the various governments of the world to lead people to believe that the moon landings actually took place. And so you will go on YouTube and you will certainly hear and you will certainly see a few persons who are contending that the moon landings never took place, and it's all been Hollywood staged, and it's all deception. Well, I have done a careful research into the issues, and as a geography and earth science teacher for over 30 years, I try to make sure that anything I pass on to my students, it can stand the scrutiny. And in fact, I feel a responsibility to make sure that what I'm telling my students, that it's really true. And I can assure you, dear listener, that the moon landings were not faked. I have studied all of the various arguments opposed to the moon landings. I have looked at all the arguments opposed to traveling to the moon and landing on the moon surface. And I can tell you, they all fall by the way. I'm going to share with you a few facts in this Get the Facts video, episode 1. The first thing I'd like to do, dear listener, is to share with you the raw facts, and then I'm going to respond to the key arguments of the conspiracy theorists. Whether they be flat earthers or they be globe earthers, it doesn't matter. Generally, they use the same kinds of arguments. Now, the first thing I'd like to tell you is that there are a wide variety of proofs, but there are 3 proofs which are very, very hard to overcome, very hard to disprove. And yes, the conspiracy theorists, they can deny them, they can say anything they want, but the challenge is for them to disprove the 3 things I'm going to share with you right now. Now, the first proof that the moon landing took place, and I said landings because the reality is that, you know, the conspiracy theorists and those who are opposed to the moon landing, they seem focused only on 1969, when United States is alleged to have landed the first human on the moon, Louis Armstrong and his astronaut companion. And so they find all kind of arguments to oppose and to try to dispute and throw out the validity of that landing. But the truth is, The United States and several other countries, which I'm going to speak of shortly, have landed on the moon several times. And so they are there wasting their time talking about the 1969 landing, and yet they are way behind the facts. They are so way behind, it's almost like they are living in the age of the dinosaurs, operating as if they have their head stuck in the sand. Now, what are the proofs we have? Let me give you three main proofs. One, today we have over 3,000 satellites that are going around the Earth. Satellites, you send them up, they are man-made objects, which are in effect robots, which go around the Earth daily. So what you will notice, you see pictures of satellites, they have their wings, quote-unquote wings, where on these wings they have solar panels, so they absorb the sunlight and they convert that sunlight to electrical energy to power these robots, so they keep going and going for very many years. Of course, now and then you will hear of a satellite failing and it will crash back to the Earth, but generally speaking they will run for very many years going around the Earth. And the truth is that there are actually satellites that even go around the moon. So we do have, dear listener, satellites which are circulating the moon, just like how we have satellites in their thousands circulating the Earth in different directions daily. And these satellites, they belong to a variety of nations. So they belong to the United States, they belong to Japan, they belong to China, Russia, India, various countries that are involved in space exploration and have the technology and the wealth to fund these operations. So we have very many satellites out there, and they serve so many different purposes. Now I must categorize satellites into two groups. You have satellites which are in the low atmosphere. They are not in space as we consider space. They are in the atmosphere where weather takes place. So these are what we call the weather satellites. So they are sent up, and as they are sent up into the atmosphere, we find that these satellites, they will be taken up, for instance, by what is called a weather balloon. So they can be released up into the atmosphere and they reach a certain height, and they will measure temperature, wind, and atmospheric pressure and so forth. So they will send back information daily to weather stations and various parts of the planet. These are the lower atmosphere or lower space satellites. Then we have the real satellites that actually go into outer space, or should I say they leave the atmosphere itself and go into space where there's no gravity to pull things back down to the Earth, and they go around the Earth daily. Over 3,000 of them are there in the atmosphere. So if you look at this diagram, the low atmosphere where our weather takes place, troposphere, is where we send up these weather satellites via weather balloons to capture information about the weather, because that's where the weather takes place, in our atmosphere. But then when you leave our atmosphere and go to space, that is where you, for instance, have the space stations built by a collaborative effort of several nations, the richer nations, Japan and Russia and the United States and so. So they build these permanent weather stations which are floating in space where there is no gravity, and astronauts visit these stations and do space work regularly. They will be there for months, and they will rotate the astronauts which move back and forth between the Earth. So this is where we're talking when we say space. And so in space we have those satellites that, here's for instance a picture of one rocket from the Apollo mission in the 1960s and 70s, actually going around or hovering above the moon's surface, and you can see the Earth in the distance, a famous photograph now called Earthrise photograph, showing that the Earth does really move as it seemed to rise above the surface of the moon in terms of the direction that the photograph was taken from. Now, so I was making the point that there are satellites which are actually out in space, and these satellites go around both the moon as well as the Earth, depending on what they are sent up for to do. Now, the same way we have the Google Earth technology, where there are satellites which go around the Earth daily and zoom in and map every inch of the Earth's surface. The same is true. There are satellites that go around the moon from various nations that zoom in and map every inch of the moon. And that is why we can actually combine pictures which give you the perfect picture layout of what the moon's surface is like. So the technology is of such where you can now combine pictures digitally to show more details. And because we're at a distance from the moon, looking at it, studying with telescopes and instruments, we can easily understand that the moon is a ball-like object, and it actually has a surface of rocks and soil that's very shiny. These are reflective agents. So I was making the point now that the various satellites that go around the moon, it's interesting that if you go to the moon, to the pictures that have been taken of every inch of the moon, we now have very many pictures of satellites that have zoomed in on the surface of the moon to, lo and behold, capture the very places, the landing sites of several of the moon landings. Why? Because at those sites we have remains of the moon expedition. So you're talking about the part of the rocket that was left behind, the flags that were planted on the moon by various nations, just not just the United States, footprints that were left by the astronauts. You also have the tracks that, in fact, here is a animated version of all of the pictures that have been gathered by the satellites. I'm trying to zoom in on the exact spots on the moon. So give me a little bit here so I can zoom in on those special locations on the moon, landing sites. Here it is bringing up one of the landing sites, showing where you have the bits and pieces of all the things that were left behind. Now, if you look carefully, there you can see the part of the rocket that was left behind called a lander. There you see the footprints or the tracks of the rovers and the astronauts as they walked over the surface of the moon. Still there in all these years, and the reason for that is simply because the moon has no atmosphere like we do, so there's no weather there. There's no rain, there's no wind, and so everything remains undisturbed. So on the surface of the moon, we still have the remains of the lander, tracks, the buggies, the rovers that were left behind, the footprints, the track prints of the rovers or buggies that were used on the moon's surface, the flags that are left behind. And it's just not one site, it's several sites, because several landings that have taken place over the years. So let me continue this video of pictures that were captured by the satellites and combined for you to see. So there we see a rover on the let me go back a bit to that. Here is the lander remaining. And you can go online and do that for yourself. Just check for pictures of the moon landings and the remains left on the moon. So there we have the satellite zooming in, and I mean there are several other examples like that of several landing sites. But what is even more compelling, dear listener, is that the astronauts, including the 1969 landing, the astronauts literally left on the moon surface what are called light reflectors. So from the 1969 landing by the Americans through to 1962, when they made about 5 other trips, additional trips, with real astronauts, live astronauts, they left what are called light reflectors. People who do physics and study of light, they left these light reflectors, which are permanently planted on the surface of the moon. And those light reflectors can be found easily by those with observatories and those who do light study as physicists. And so they can be found easily by the various nations: China, Japan, Russia, India, and those who study light. So they use light technology to determine, for instance, the distance that the moon is from the Earth, to determine whether or not the Earth in its orbit around the moon, rather, in its orbit around the Earth, is in any way changing over the years, which they have discovered that there is a slight drift of the moon in its orbit. And they also will study light technology, so they can set clocks. So they can set clocks to work properly. And lo and behold, these light reflectors have been used over the very many decades since the moon landings started in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. And these light reflectors are being used regularly, daily, constantly by various nations to do light study. Now, how can you disprove that? The flags that have been left on the moon by the moon landers, whether it be, and remember now, the moon landings are of 2 types. We have moon landings which are accomplished by humans, so they call these manned operations. There are moon landings that have taken place by robots. So the United States has the enviable record of landing humans on the moon more than any other, over 5-6 times, because of course of the wealth of the United States. But you'll be interested to know, dear listener, that the Russians were the first to land on the moon, but not by humans. They landed on the moon with robots, send a rover up there, and so the Russians were the first to send humans into space, meaning outside our atmosphere and in the outer atmosphere above our heads, where there's no gravity. The Russians were the first to do that. In the 1950s, Yuri Gagarin was the first human to enter space. And interestingly, the Russians were the first to land on the moon. United States therefore decided to beat the Russians, because at that time in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, there was this very, very strong rivalry between the United States and Russia to conquer space, as it were. And so the United States pledged that it would be the first nation to put humans on the moon. Now, here's the interesting thing. The Russians, who have been the avowed enemies of the United States, they have never yet contested or tried to deny or disprove the reality that the United States landed on the moon, not just once, but several times with real humans. Now think about this. The Russians, who would do anything to discredit the United States in the world. You think if the United States never landed on the moon, that Russia would have kept silent? They have not. They have not denied the United States landing on the moon, because they have the proofs. They have their own technology and observatories and their own space program, and they know that the reality that the United States did land on the moon and continues to do so repeatedly since that time in 1969. The Chinese also have sent unmanned operations to the moon and landed robots on the moon. In fact, the Chinese have their own flag. The Chinese and the Indians have their own flags planted on the moon as well. So the United States, the Russians, the Indians, in fact, let me now list the nations that have actually landed on the moon. This is a matter of public record. This is no conspiracy to cover up nothing and to fool the public. So the Russians first landed with robots. Then the United States landed with humans in 1969 and several times since that time. I mean, dear listener, all you have to do is simply go to Google and type in the words, the moon landings and which nations have landed on the moon. And read and get the details for yourself. Go to Britannica Encyclopedia. Go to Wikipedia and just read up on the moon landings. And you will see all the evidence for yourself. Not just these little cooked up videos by conspiracy theorists who are trying to discredit what they don't have a clue about. So the reality is the Russians, the Americans, the Indians, the Japanese, the Chinese, the people from Israel, Luxembourg, and there's even a group of astronauts and space explorers in Europe called the European Space Agency that have sent operations to the moon. Collaborative effort of various nations in Europe. So the conspiracy theorists are there trying to discredit the so-called trip of the United States landing in 1969. The moon landing, singular, when they are way behind the facts. So the Russians, the Chinese, the Japanese, who have been enemies of the United States, have never tried to discredit the United States' claim for landing on the moon several times, because they themselves have done the same via robots. And in addition to that, I mean, they have the technology and the actual proof that what the United States has been claiming is true. So you will never hear them trying to discredit what they know to be the real facts. That's the second proof. The third proof is that you have a lot of persons who are what we call independent astronomers. They don't work with NASA, the official American organization which deals with space exploration. That so-called villain NASA, which is trying to fool the public according to conspiracy theorists. So these various independent astronomers from various nations, they have the technology, telescopes and observatories, and they have proved for themselves what I'm telling you. They are able to zoom in on the moon and see the various landing sites and the left behind the remains of the moon operations. The footprints and the bottom pieces of rockets and the rovers left behind and the track prints left behind. All these years, still there. In fact, expedition to the moon continues as late as 2019. And I think there was another trip to the moon by another nation in 2020. It's ongoing. And so these independent astronomers, they are able to pick up these light reflectors on the moon left behind by the astronauts, the landing sites. They are able to actually see operations going to the moon and track them. And they have been doing that for years. Now, the conspiracy theorists, whether they be flat earthers or they be round earthers or globe earthers, how do they disprove all of what I'm saying here? How? What are they going to say? All of these nations, many of them are enemies of each other, have all sat down and conspired to lie to the world that you can really go to the moon? To what end? For what purpose? How would that be possible? How is that realistic? This is the kind of conspiracy theories that some of the members of the public have bought into. And they really expect reasonable thinking individuals who do real research and know about the facts to buy into these conspiracy theories. These conspiracy theories hold no water. And so, dear listener, I am pointing out that while there are many other proofs for the moon landings, it's very hard to discredit these three proofs. Actual landing sites which can be found on the moon by satellites from various nations, zoom in on those, just like you can zoom in on your own street using Google Earth today and find your own house. The same can be done with the moon surface because the satellites have mapped every inch of the moon over the years. And the pictures and the images are a matter of public record. Nobody is hiding anything. Nobody is doctoring anything. Nobody is photoshopping anything. And speaking of Photoshop, let me now go into my response to the general arguments used by the conspiracy theorists. They say that NASA has been doctoring pictures for years and images and videos to fool the public. Well, think about this. The first image taken from directly above the moon was in the 1950s when the Russians went into space. Here you see a black and white picture from just above the surface of the moon. Looking into the distance, you see the Earth, one side in darkness, the other side in light. At that time in the 1950s, going into the 1960s, there was no technology called Photoshop. Photoshopping was invented in 1988 by the Adobe publishers or app producers. And so, if there was no technology to doctor images and pictures called Photoshop, what are the conspiracy theorists then left with? In addition, dear listener, here we have a picture showing a satellite, or it might have been one of the Apollo missions, hovering above the surface of the moon. And this picture was taken by the master rocket ship above, looking down as the moon landing spaceship was about to dock. This is a picture taken from in the 1960s, 1968 I think it was, even before humans landed on the moon, long before there was any Photoshop that came several decades after. The argument from the conspiracy theorists don't hold any water. Here is a famous Earthrise photograph of the Earth taken from just above the surface of the moon, showing clearly that the flat earthers don't have a clue what they're talking about. The Earth is a ball, one side in darkness forever, one side in light forever. And all that changes night to day is simply the rotation of the Earth. The rotation of the Earth is so easily proven today from the space stations. Space stations which are permanently built stations by several nations collaborating, Japanese, Chinese, Russians, Americans. These space stations, they have cameras pointed at the Earth 24/7. And you can clearly see the gradual rotation of the Earth in these videos. You have two types of videos where you can see what happens for real in life. You have those videos which can take things that happen extremely slow. Like, for instance, you have seen videos where you can watch a seed germinating, growing out of the ground slowly, or you can see a flower opening. And what happens is that the videos are the cameras are posted, and they take the pictures as the events as they happen slowly, and then all they do is simply speed up the film, and you can see a flower opening or a seed germinating. The same is true with the cameras that are mounted on the international space stations, pointing down at the Earth, showing us clearly that the Earth is indeed a ball that is rotating slowly. Nothing need to be doctored, nothing need to be created by Hollywood to fool the public. To what end? What would be the real reason for doing that? Doesn't make any sense, conspiracy theorists. And so the reality, dear listener, is that we have real live evidence from various nations, not just NASA in the United States, that the moon actually has been landed on. You can prove it independently by way of independent astronomers. The various nations that have been enemies of the United States never once challenged the reality of them landing on the moon several times. China, Russia, Japan. And they themselves have done the same, landing on the moon several times via robots and moon rovers. So, dear listener, I don't want to make this presentation long, but let me now quickly respond to some of the arguments that I have not responded to yet. The argument, for instance, is that the landings have been staged in movie studios. And how come, for instance, astronauts were shown on the moon planting flag and the flag is flapping in the wind and flying? That's not true. The flags that are still on the moon up to this day, that can be zoomed in on by independent astronomers from various nations, that can be zoomed in on by various satellites from different nations. These flags, because the astronauts realize that there is no wind on the moon, they simply held up those flags so the flag can be held outwards by wires. And simply because the moon is a shiny surface, you find that light reflecting off the surface of the flag can give the impression that the flag is flapping when it's not. And it is held out by wires, not by wind blowing it. Some say, how come when you're on the moon, according to pictures so-called taken on the moon, and when you look in the distance, you see no stars in the distance? How come? Because they don't understand the moon is so reflective as a shiny surface that the light from the sun is reflecting off the surface, which actually covers up the stars in the distance. That's the reason why we don't see stars in the daytime. The stars are always shining, they are always shining non-stop. But during the day, we don't see them. Why? Because the light from our sun is so bright that it drowns out those distant twinkling stars, as it were. So you only get to see the stars at night, which are always shining, because the sun now, its light is being drowned out by the darkness of the night. And so you're able to see those stars. But on the moon, the surface is so reflective that it actually gives you extra bright pictures when you take them, and it actually drowns out the background so you don't see stars in the background. Remember now, the stars are shining from a very far distance, and they are just the same way we don't see them in the daytime on the earth, but at night the same is true, same principle at work. Combination of the light from the sun as well as the shiny surface prevents you from seeing the background of stars. And I've seen, for instance, conspiracy theories say, when you see rovers leaving the moon's surface, not rovers, these rockets which take back the astronauts from the moon's surface up to the master rocket waiting out in space. Who was left on the moon to take those videos? Not realizing that these are simply animated illustrations. Just the same way we can watch movies of the creation of the earth and the flood of Noah. We weren't there, but we can create pictures to illustrate what has happened. And so when you see animated pictures or animated videos of the moon landings, and it is not necessarily those live pictures, it can simply be animated versions of the trip. I recognize, dear listener, that every argument that the opposers to the moon landings have come with, they have been debunked and can be easily debunked. I don't want to get into all the technicalities and all the technical arguments used by conspiracy theorists and the technical arguments to debunk them, because dealing with you, the public, in a short half an hour video, I don't want to burden with too much technicalities, but I'm dealing with just the general arguments which even the normal person who is not versed in earth science can understand. I want to close off now in my response to those flat earthers who are Bible believers. It's kind of disappointing that there are people who would use the Bible to try to tell you that humans can't go to the moon, for instance, because there is a firmament that is above the earth that encases and traps us in that encased firmament, and we can't escape. Now, here is how that argument makes no sense. The flat earthers who are Bible believers, they will tell you that the firmament above our heads is a solid structure, solid dome that traps us, and it is impenetrable. But within that firmament, under it, God placed the sun and the moon, just as you're seeing on the screen. So the question is, if the moon is inside this so-called encasement that you can burst through that tough firmament to go to outer space, what is to prevent you from going to the moon if it's inside? What is? Nothing at all. So even their own argument falls flat on its face when you think about what they're trying to say. Firmament traps you inside because it's tough, solid barrier. You can't get out of it to go to space. But they also want to believe that inside, under that barrier, is the moon. And it is because of that barrier above it why you can't get to the moon that is inside it. Makes no sense. In addition to that, some of them quote the scriptures to say that the moon is not reflecting light from the sun, because the sun, the Bible says the moon has her own light. And so there's going to come a time when God is going to cause the sun to not show her light. When it comes to the scriptures, I can tell you this. I have done a careful study of the scriptures, and they say nothing that the flat earthers are trying to say they say. So for instance, here in Isaiah 13 and verse 10, you notice that it speaks about the moon having her light, her own light. Ezekiel 32:7, the moon having her light. So what? There is no explanation in the Bible in terms of the technical aspects of science as to what makes the light from the moon shines on us. The Bible is not a science book. It doesn't go into details to explain what's the nature of the moon shining its light. So there's nothing in the Bible which tells you how the moon shines its light and why it has light. But science has now made us know that it's a reflective agent. So it reflects the light from what the Bible calls the greater light, the sun, and shines it upon us in the night. So if they're going to use the Bible, then here is the Bible. The Bible says God is light. In him there's no darkness at all. In Jesus was life, and the life was the light of men. So everything we get from God as light, we are reflectors of it as his children. Christians, I'm speaking now. So we reflect the light from God in a spiritual sense. Since God is light and he's the source of all light, whether physically or spiritually. So any light that we have in us, we are reflectors of the light from God. And yet the Bible describes that light that we reflect in the spiritual sense as our light. Let your light so shine before men, Jesus told us. Notice, let your light, and yet the light we have is from him. He says that ye are the light of the world, speaking to us Christians, and yet it is Jesus who is that light. He says, I am the light of the world. Why? Because he's divine, just like the Father, who is the obvious source of our light. But notice, the light that we get from God and we reflect it back to others, to the glory of God, of course. God is describing that light as your light, my light, your light as a Christian. And so this argument about the moon having her light must mean that it has its own literal self-supporting light. Makes no sense. Why? Because the Bible didn't tell you how the light from the moon operates. And even if it is reflecting light just as us humans, and the Bible calls it her light. It's the same when it calls our light, yet it is coming from God. So the arguments from the Bible users who are flat earthers, they are not holding up, dear listener. And as I close, I want to direct you, if you want to get a lot more information on how to debunk the false arguments of flat earthers who use the Bible to teach that the earth is flat and that the moon, you can't go to the moon because you're prevented from going to space by the tough firmament. None of those taught by the Bible. None. I would advise you, go to my YouTube channel. There you're seeing it on top left of the screen. It's called DDGILLIYT. Go to my YouTube channel and look for these videos. Debunking Christian flat earthers, including certain Seventh-day Adventists. Biblical, the flat earth theory falls flat. Analyzing the flat earth scriptures and debunking errors. Biblically, the flat earth theory falls flat. These are videos where I carefully go through the scriptures to show that the flat earthers and those who oppose moon landings, they have no biblical support whatsoever. They think they do, but it is simply showing that they lack real understanding of how to properly analyze the scriptures. In fact, there's a recent series I started called, if you look at the top of the screen, you'll see the Bible and True Earth Signs. If you go to part 2, I think it is, if you go to part 2 of that series on my YouTube channel, you will find that I have addressed in passing the issue of the moon landings. Part 2, I think it is, or it might be part 3. Let me just check to confirm. So the Bible and True Earth Signs, you can find the support for the moon landings in passing in part, I'm trying to confirm, I think it might be part 3. It might be part 3, or it could be part 2. But the reality is that none of the arguments that the conspiracy theorists come with to oppose the moon landings or to say that the earth is flat and not a globe, none of them can stand to real careful analysis and scrutiny. None of them. And I'm speaking now from the standpoint of being a classroom teacher of earth science for over 30 years, and as a Bible believer for over 40 years, and an apologist, defender of the scriptures for all my life. And so, dear listener, I close by saying, don't be fooled. The moon has been landed on over a dozen times. Just simply Google the moon landings and the countries involved in the moon landings and read up on the proofs. And you can even go to YouTube and watch the contending videos, those videos that oppose the conspiracy theorists who say the moon landings never take place or never took place, and see how their weak arguments are debunked. And always get the facts. Don't just run with the first thing you read or see or hear. Get the facts. Dig for the facts. Analyze the facts. And make sure that you continue to educate yourself and not be fooled by conspiracy theories. Thank you for listening.